You know, we get the privilege of doing an immense thing. Just, it's incredible for me because, you know, I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be a pastor. Actually, my mother used to tell me that I was supposed to be a minister. She was a preacher's kid. And I guess there's something about, as the son or the daughter of a pastor, that it was her responsibility to raise some boys and send one of them into the ministry. It was supposed to be the Presbyterian ministry that I was to be a part of. And I remember her telling me that as I was a little boy, and then as I grew older and my behavior started to come out, she stopped talking about that. She was just hopeful I'd stay out of prison. But we get to be pastors. Amen. We get to be ministers. You know, we wake up every morning, and that's the task that is before us. I've done other things in life, and some of you might have as well. But you know, this is an incredible responsibility and privilege that God has given to us. And I know that it's not easy. Some people think the life of a pastor, wow. You know, you've heard it, you only work a few days a week, you get to go play golf, you get to go out to eat all the time, you get to do these things. And life, you know, my brother who took over the business that I sold to him when I went into ministry just thinks, you know, I've got a cushy life. In fact, when I thought about going into full-time ministry, this was my thought. Wow, to get paid to study the Bible and to pray. That's what I thought ministry was about. It didn't take very long to realize that while there is some of that, that's not where we spend most of our time, unfortunately. And so this morning I want to talk to you about something, and we're not going to talk about evangelism right now. That'll come up. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But I want to talk to you about being a pastor. Have you ever been tempted to quit? We don't like to talk about that among pastors, but I don't know what has happened, but over the past year I've run into more people who used to be in ministry that aren't in ministry any longer. We all know that we're called to do this. If you're not called, you've got to be crazy to do what we do. And it's not because of the money, because quite frankly, you know, the Lord provides for us. It isn't what it maybe used to be, where you would have to take a vow of poverty to be an Adventist pastor. But you know, we get paid okay. The benefits are good. The church takes care of us. It's not the sacrifice of salary, but it is really about devoting yourself to something that is difficult to devote yourself to. It's easy to devote yourself to Jesus, but it's more difficult to devote yourself to church. And I want you to know that I can't count the number of times that I have been tempted to quit. And I would imagine you can as well. I remember the first time I got up to preach. I made my preaching debut in one of Reggie's previous churches, the Tulsa Church. That's where I became a Seventh-day Adventist, and so that was my home church. And it was probably about a year after I had become an Adventist, and the pastor, I don't know why, I wasn't an elder at the time, but maybe he saw something budding in my life, and he asked me if I'd be willing to preach one Sabbath. And you know, there's this thing that when you get asked to do something weeks and months before you have to do it, it sounds easier, doesn't it? You know, if he came up to me and said, I need you to preach next Sabbath, I would have run. I would have turned away. But it was a couple months away, and so I thought, well, yeah, I'll do that. And as the time came, I got more and more nervous. My greatest fear is that I would get up and preach for about 5 minutes and run out of things to say, and then sit down. And so I studied like crazy. And I was poring over my notes on the platform there, and the head elder was getting a little nervous when he was looking at all my pages of notes. And he leaned over to me and he gave me some words of advice. It was Jack Wall, by the way, that gave me these words. He says, Bill, if you can't say it in 15 minutes, you can't say it no matter how long you try. And I had at least 45 minutes worth of material there that I've been then trying to figure out how I was going to pare it down. But I got up and I preached. Somebody has made the comment that sometimes when you do things and you're very nervous, your knees knock so loud that they applaud you. And that's kind of what was going on. I was kind of nervous, but then after a while I kind of got into it. And I was thinking to myself as I was preaching, I could get used to this. When it was over, the people applauded. Never heard that before in Adventist church. Occasionally special music it might happen, but not after a sermon. And then I had to do what you do most every Sabbath, is you go to the back door. I don't know where that tradition started. And immediately you get the reviews. That either you did well and people will tell you that, or you didn't, and they'll feel compelled to lie to you. And tell you, and as I was shaking hands, nobody was really looking at me, and nobody was making any comments, and finally, this rather elderly lady came out, and I still remember what she said to me. She said, "Don't worry, son, you've got to get better." As I drove home that day, I thought, well, maybe I'm not called to ministry. I was tempted to never preach again. When things don't go the way we think they should, we're tempted to pick up our marbles and to go home. Fast forward about 15 years later, we had launched our church plant there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and for several months I had served, almost a year I had served as the leader. It was a company status, and you have a leader and you have a treasurer. I love that organizational structure. You don't have to mess with a board or any other officers. It's very efficient, but it can be dangerous. And as we were getting ready to organize as a church, then my job was going to go away. And that afternoon, we were to have this nominating committee where then you select officers and you create the structure of the church. As we were working with the conference on this organizational thing, the subject of a pastor came up. When we organized as a church, we had about 75 or so members there that would be part of this brand new church. And as we were talking about that, and they began to ask me what I wanted to do and what role that I wanted to play, I remember they immediately asked me, "Are you interested in planting another church?" Because Tulsa is 500,000 people, and there's really only 2 or 3 churches, and quite frankly, we could have a dozen there, or even more.
Amen.
And so they asked, "Do you want to plant another church?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, what would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to see this one grow." Well, it's organized with 75 members. That's a pretty good church in Oklahoma. Maybe it is here in Arkansas as well. It's not bad. It's a good size. And they said, "Well, how much do you think it could grow?" And I said, "Well, I think we could be several hundred." I didn't want to scare them. But we had already decided that we were going to set a goal. I believed in goals, and before we ever started, we wanted 3 years to be 300 people, and 5 years to be 500 people. And they just looked at me like I was from Mars. And we ended that meeting, and over the next several weeks, we began to dialogue, and of course, their comment was, a church that size has to have a real pastor. Do we have any bivocational pastors here today? Need a real pastor. And I understood that, and so we continued to dialogue, and they finally said, "Look, you know, this is a little bit unusual, but if you'll sell your business, we'll give you a license and you can be a pastor." And so my wife and I prayed a lot about that, because we had been very blessed in our business, and I knew this was going to be a big lifestyle change, but we really felt God was leading in it. And so I told him, yes, I'd do that. And we kind of kept it a little bit quiet, and the time came for us to organize as a church, and I can remember the conference president kind of making that announcement that I would be the pastor. And as we were ending that meeting and several people were leaving, I was again at the door. I've learned to stay away from the door, the back door of the church. In fact, I don't do that anymore. But I was shaking hands and well-wishers and all of that, and I still remember one gentleman, and more elderly gentleman, came by, shook my hand. I still remember what he said to me. It seems like he always remembered the painful things. He said, "I can't believe they won't give us a real pastor." And he walked out the door. I didn't know what to say. You know, what do you say? You keep a smile on your face, you shake their hands, and you wish them well. What made that terribly painful for me was that we had an evangelistic meeting, and this guy had become a meeting during that meeting. I was the one that preached that series. I was the one that was in his living room that led him to Christ as we knelt together. But he wanted a real pastor. I went home that day, ready to quit, and I hadn't even completed one day. One more story. You see, you never hear about this stuff. All you ever hear about is Tulsa blowing and going, and anything we do, everything works out right. Our very first evangelistic meeting, we pulled out all the stops. We poured a lot of money into it. We advertised like crazy, and the Lord blessed. Opening night came, and I was going to be the speaker, and we had over 300 visitors pour into that hotel. I was excited. Man, 300 people. I thought, this is really going to launch our church at this point, because we were barely surviving at that moment. 300 non-members showed up. I was the preacher. I got up and I preached my heart out. When it's over, sometimes you're not the best one to figure out how well you did, but I thought I did okay. The next night, we lost 100 people. And man, it's hard to do that, isn't it? Those of you that have done evangelism, and you do it opening night, you see all these people, and you really put your heart and soul into it. The next night, you just know so many didn't like what you preached, or didn't like you, or didn't connect with you. And so the next night, we lost 100 people. The next night, I lost 100 more. And I tell you, I had a smile on my face around my little core group there, but I was hurting inside. And the problem was, I wasn't sure that I was going to make it to the end of the meeting with anybody left, the way we were losing them so fast. But 3 or 4 weeks later, when the meeting was over, we had gone from 300 visitors to 5. And we baptized 2 people. I didn't feel that way at the time. Come on, let's admit it. 300 visitors, and 2 people were baptized. I was tempted to quit. I was tempted to quit. I was tempted to think that this isn't me. At every turn, it seems like it has been a struggle. I suppose we could go around the room today as pastors, and if we were honest, we could all expose some things in our past, and maybe even what's going on in our ministry right now. I asked a pastor once, I said, have you ever tempted to quit? And he says, yeah, every Sabbath. It's a part of human nature. And I'm convinced that it's natural for us to question this and to be challenged, because things don't always go well. They don't. And I've been in ministry 8 years, and I can tell you, I've had some terrible moments, some terrible failures. What I at least consider failure, and other people looking on would see as a failure. I remember my first conference president, Rodney Grove, the one who called me into ministry, introducing me at some meeting, I can't remember, he said, what I like about Bill is he's not afraid to fail. I thought, man, that's not a very good introduction. And what he was saying is, Bill has failed more than any other pastor I've met. Because we've done some difficult things. Not everything has been successful. Bad things happen, and we're tempted to quit. Anyone ever heard of a preacher by the name of John Wesley? I got this from the internet, so I'm sure it's true. Right? Here's a page from his journal. Maybe you've read it. Sunday a.m., May 5, preached at St. Anne's. Was asked not to come back anymore. This is John Wesley, probably one of the greatest preachers of his day. Sunday p.m. that same evening, May 5th, preached at St. John's. Deacon said, get out and stay out. The next week, May 12, preached at St. Jude's. Can't go back there either. That evening, preached at St. George. Kicked out again. The next Sunday, preached at St. somebody else's. Deacons called a special meeting. Said I couldn't return. That evening, preached on the street, and I was kicked off the street. The next week, I was preached out in a meadow, chased out of a meadow when a bull was turned loose during a service. The next week, preached out on the edge of town, and I was kicked off the highway. That evening, the afternoon service, preached in a pasture, 10,000 people came. I don't know if that's true, but I can imagine even a great preacher like John Wesley had his moments. In fact, you know, what I love about being a Seventh-day Adventist is that the history of our church has been chronicled and has been captured. And if you go to the ABC, you'll find these little books by the name of Arthur White. Little brown books. I don't know what the whole series is called, but they're divided up into 5 or 10 or 15-year segments. You have the early years and the Elmshaven years and the Australian years. And you read there, they're a diary. And you read about James and Ellen White going out, being these itinerant preachers, and you would think the Lord's anointed, God's messenger, everywhere they went, there would be huge crowds. But there were some places they showed up and nobody showed up for the meeting. And you read in those pages and in those comments discouragement and a struggle. I've been thinking a lot about my life lately. I've turned, let's just say I'm on the other side of 45. And I realize that most of my life is behind me. I spent most of my better years doing things I shouldn't have done. Didn't really become a Seventh-day Adventist until I was about 20 or 25. And I've been in the church for the last 20 or 25 years. And I can tell you that I realize the best years are behind me. I'm not going to be any stronger than I am today. I'm not going to be any prettier. I'm not going to have any more hair. No more money, I'm sure, than I had in my past. But I've been thinking about how I want my life to finish. I don't know if you've thought about that. But you know, somebody has done some studies in the Christian church and they have decided that only 20% of the people will finish well. Finish well. Amen. I don't want to just finish. We're all going to finish. But I want to finish well. Now, I've been thinking about what that would look like for me, and we came up with 2 suggestions that I would like to offer to you. Because God has called us to finish well. And if we're called to ministry, we're to finish ministry well. I like the fact that at least in our conference, and probably here and others in the Southwest, that when pastors retire, they don't quit ministry. You know, how could you quit? It's the same way when I go and I interview these graduates out of Andrews or other places. I want to know, what have you been doing? Don't talk to me just about the schoolwork and the things that have been assigned to you. Tell me what you're doing on Sabbath. Are you in a church? Are you preaching? Are you doing evangelism? Are you leading a person to Christ? Because then it is not just a job. It is a calling. And whether you have a job or you're paid to do it, you ought to be doing it. And so we want to finish ministry well. 2 things for me. One is, I want to be more in love with Jesus at the end of my life than at the beginning. And you know, that might seem like a no-brainer, but as you look around the Adventist church, that doesn't seem to be the norm. It doesn't. In fact, we even kind of joke about it. Somebody that's brand new as a Christian, they're all on fire and they love the Lord and they have that thing that we call the first love. And we know what happens. We see them in our church, they're almost bothersome. They're going around all excited about this, wanting to do this, wanting to do that. And we think to ourselves, just give them time. And they'll become like the rest of us. It shouldn't be that way. We should be more committed and more in love and more excited about being a Christian every day. If we're not, what kind of a message does that send to the world? You know, because a lot of things start out big and fizzle. Sin's that way. If you don't think sin is fun, you haven't done it. I mean, that's why we have a problem with sin, isn't it? Because it's enticing and it's exciting and it's got an allure. You know, our kids know better. Sin is fun. You got it. It starts out big. It starts out exciting, and then as you really see what sin has to offer, we realize it's not as fun. Somebody said, you know, the devil promises the most and delivers the least. And that's the way sin is. But ministry and being a Christian shouldn't be that way. It should start out big and just get bigger. So I want to be more in love with Jesus at the end of my life. The second one is this, and this is probably why I bring this up. And it says, I have to come into alignment with the will of God for my life. As a Christian, God has called us to be a part of His family. As a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, we get a new worldview. We understand some things. I love being an Adventist because it has answered the most important questions in my life. I'm not an accident. I didn't evolve. I'm not a surprise here on the face of the earth. That God has destined, God has ordained me, God has purposed that I would be here. I am created for a purpose. That's just as a Christian. But as a pastor who has been called, I believe that I have a role to play right here, right now. Could you think of anything that would be more tragic than reaching the end of your life and not fulfilling God's purpose for why you were created? Talk about the woulda, shoulda, couldas. You and I have both been in a lot of hospital rooms of people who are dying. It's at that moment that people begin to reflect and they begin to evaluate their life. And I've been in those rooms when you've seen someone that has lived for the Lord and has lived a surrendered life, and there is peace. There is death almost is a relief. I mean, we don't welcome it, but it's a relief. It's welcomed. They're tired. They live their life well and they're ready to rest in Jesus. I've also been in those rooms that there is no peace. They've made mistakes and all they can think about is how they did not do what God had called them to do. I want to finish well. I want to come into alignment with what God has called for me, and that means that I cannot be a quitter. We live in a society of quitters. You only have to go out to my garage and my barn and see all the projects I've started to know I'm a quitter. You know, I used to watch that television program, This Old House. And the guys made it look so easy. I'd make a trip to the hardware store and I'd buy this and I'd buy that and I'd take it home and I would begin to work on it and you know, my stuff never quite worked out the way they did, and I would get frustrated and I would put it aside, and it's still there. Monuments to the fact that I'm a quitter. As I think about my life, if I would have finished just some of the things that I would have started, what would be accomplished? What would I would have accomplished in my life? I'd be able to play the piano like Don does. I'd be able to play the guitar like you. I'd have the world's best stamp collection and coin collection and all of that. And while I will admit the world is no worse off because I cannot do those things, boy, if I mess up my relationship with Christ, the world will be different. Because we're called to make it different. We're called to finish well.